Some of you may have watched the new Mel Brooks series, History of the World Part 2 on Hulu this week, which, of course, is the sequel to the classic 1981 Mel Brooks movie, History of the World Part 1. And one of the most famous scenes in the original movie is the scene in which Mel Brooks plays Moses on Mount Sinai, and God, the voice of Carl Reiner, by the way, calls down to Moses in a booming voice and says, "Moses, can you hear me?" And Moses says, "Yes, God, a deaf man could hear you." And shortly thereafter, he comes down from Mount Sinai with not 10, but 15 commandments on 3 tablets. And of course, he drops one of those tablets and it smashes, leaving him with just 10 commandments. And it's so fitting that the sequel series to History of the World Part 1 was released this week, because the inspiration for that scene in the original movie happens to take place in this week's Torah portion. This morning we read Parshat Ki Tisa, which recounts the story of the golden calf. And Moses comes down from Mount Sinai carrying the 2 tablets containing the 10 commandments that were given directly to him by God, only to discover that the Israelites had already broken the commandment against creating and worshiping graven images. At the foot of the mountain, the Israelites were worshiping the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. And in a fit of fury, Moses hurls the tablets to the ground, Vayeshaber otam tachat hahar, and he shattered them at the foot of the mountain. And after Moses smashes the tablets, God tells him to ascend the mountain one more time to get the tablets once again. But this time, God isn't simply going to give Moses the tablets. Rather, Moses is commanded to carve the second set of tablets for himself. And maybe this is a simple punishment. Moses smashed the first set of tablets in a fit of anger, so God punishes him by commanding him to carve the second set of tablets. Or maybe it wasn't a punishment. Maybe God was trying to teach Moses and all of us a lesson about what it means to value something that you produce with your own 2 hands. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes about the Israeli behavioral economist Dan Ariely, who conducted a series of experiments on what he calls the IKEA effect. And that name, of course, comes from IKEA furniture. When you put a piece of furniture together, even a simple piece of furniture from IKEA, you tend to feel a certain sense of pride in what you have built. Even if someone in Sweden or the Netherlands designed the coffee table and produced the pieces and wrote out the instructions, when you put it together, you have the right to be able to say, "I made this." And you feel a much stronger sense of attachment to that table as a result. In the words of the psalmist, when you eat the fruit of the labor of your hands, then you will be happy. And by the way, I think IKEA furniture was intended for rabbis, because I can literally barely tell the difference between a screwdriver and a wrench, but I think even I could probably put together an IKEA table, maybe. And to test the IKEA effect, this Israeli behavioral economist Dan Ariely solicited volunteers to make origami models by elaborately folding pieces of paper. And then he asked the volunteers how much they would be willing to pay to keep their own origami creations. And the average answer was 25 cents. And then he asked other people what they would be willing to pay for the origami that his volunteers produced, and the average answer was 5 cents. In other words, people were willing to pay up to 5 times as much as something was really worth if it was something that they had produced themselves. As the study proved, the more work one puts into a project, the greater sense of value one attributes to the final product. The greater the effort, the greater the love for what we have made. And that's why, by the way, family fortunes are so often squandered by the children, and especially the grandchildren of those who made them. 60% of the time, a family's money is exhausted by the children of the person who created the wealth. And in 90% of cases, I read this in a study this week, it's almost entirely gone by the time the last grandchild has died. As Michael Klepper and Robert Gunther wrote in their book about the richest Americans in history called The Wealthy 100, the Vanderbilts are the best example of this phenomenon. In the 19th century, Cornelius Vanderbilt built his fortune on railroads and shipping, and if you adjust for inflation, at the time of his death in 1877, he was worth approximately $200 billion. Yet his children and his grandchildren did nothing to preserve that fortune. They built huge mansions, they threw massive parties, and they very freely spent their family money while they did nothing to maintain that money. And in the mid-1970s, about 100 years after Cornelius Vanderbilt died, the Vanderbilts held a famous family reunion, and 120 Vanderbilts attended that reunion, and there was not a single millionaire among them, because they hadn't been the ones to build the fortune. And because they weren't the ones to build it, that fortune didn't have the same sense of value to them, and they threw it away. And I think that's precisely the lesson that God teaches Moses in this week's Torah portion. Moses smashed that first set of tablets, just like the Vanderbilts squandered their family fortune, because he had not carved those tablets for himself. He had no real sense of attachment to the first set of tablets because they were handed to him on a silver platter by God. It was only after he poured his blood, sweat, and tears into carving the second set of tablets that he understood how profoundly valuable they truly were. And the rabbis teach that both sets of tablets were carried in the ark. Luchot veshivrei luchot munachin ba'aron. Both the tablets and the shards of the broken tablets were held in the ark. And maybe both sets of tablets were kept together because God never wanted our ancestors to forget this profoundly important lesson. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about clergy of all faith traditions experimenting with ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence programs to write their sermons. And there are a lot of arguments that are being made in favor of AI-generated sermons. Not only have these artificial intelligence programs proven that they can produce excellent, nuanced speeches, but they can save rabbis a huge amount of time. Instead of spending hours and hours writing sermons each week, rabbis and priests can now devote their time to serving their congregations in all kinds of different ways. But I, for one, am not willing to go there. Because in order to find true value in what I teach from the Bima each week, it is of paramount importance to me as a rabbi that I actually spend the time to carve out my own sermon. Because if a sermon was simply handed to me by an artificial intelligence program, just like God handed that first set of tablets to Moses, then what value would that sermon have? As Michelangelo once wrote, the mind and the soul become ennobled by the endeavor to create. And that same principle applies to the collective work that I think we have to put into this synagogue. The founders of Temple Beth Shalom poured their heart and souls into this place, but the work that they did is not sufficient. If we don't work equally as hard as the prior generations to maintain this synagogue, to nurture it, and to ensure that it continues to thrive and to grow, then ultimately this place won't have any value to us, because we will have played no role in building it. It's only once we put the work in to make TBS successful, to carve it and to shape it for ourselves, that we will ultimately understand the true value of this synagogue and this community. Because the more work one puts into a project, the greater sense of value one attributes to the final product. The greater the effort, the greater the love for what we have made. In the words of the psalmist, Ma'aseh Yadeinu Konanehu, establish the work of our hands. And let us say, Amen. We rise for Chatzi Kaddish on page 4.